Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about game time. And by that I mean timed quests, and even more than just timed quests, and also the concept of time in a game. This comes from a question from Fanda6122 who asked, have you done a video on clocks and in-game time yet? Many modern CRPGs don't force your hand or have any sense of urgency, even the ones that do overland travel well. Good question. It raises a lot of bigger issues than just putting in timed quests. So I kind of wanted to start with that and then get to the bigger issues of time in game. So let's start with timed quests. We did this in Fallout. You had to go get the water chip or game over. Never did it after that. And let's talk about why. I was going to say, let's break this down into the pros and cons of timed quests. But there's really only one pro to a timed quest, and that is adding a sense of urgency into the game. You've got to do this. If you don't do this in a certain amount of time, the quest fails. And if it's one that the game is required for a main story, it's game over. Otherwise, the quest fails and it's marked as failed and you cannot recover from that. I've had people go, well, it does other things. It adds consequence and all that. Well, so do all my other quests. Most of my quests, especially main story quests, have some kind of consequence. So consequence is not unique to timed quests. So the only thing I think that was a pro was that sense of urgency. So let's talk about why that isn't a good thing. Why this really breaks down to why does requiring immediate attention from the player, why is that a bad thing? And for those of you who know my channel and have watched a lot of things, I'm going to talk about player agency and all that. But let's really talk about what that means. First off, when this quest arrives and the player's like, oh, here's a quest, and now it's time, timer's ticking, the player may already be doing another quest. And it's like, I want to do this other one. And what if that other quest is timed? If you overuse timed quests and you end up getting 2 timed quests, it may not be possible to do both of them. Which means you can't use timed quests too frequently. Which means you're not going to get your sense of urgency that often. So you better have something else your game is offering. Because the moment you give me 2 timed quests, and there's no way I could do both of them in time, is my shelf moment for your game. But even more than the player may already be doing a quest, on a timed quest, the player might be just doing something they want to finish. Maybe they're crafting things, or maybe they're out collecting materials for crafting things, or maybe they're exploring. They're like, I want to find everything in this section of the map. I want to uncover all the fast travel points. I want to find this village. I want to find this cave I heard about, just so it's marked on my map and I know it's close by. Suddenly they get a timed quest. And with that timed quest comes obligation. Obligation isn't fun. And people who say, well, I'm using obligation as a motivator, that still doesn't make it fun. You're justifying using it. It's not fun. And, I've had a game where one of the pillars was fun trumps realism. It should have been fun trumps everything. If you suggest something that isn't fun, it goes. But even worse than what I've already mentioned is I have a whole video about multiple quest solutions that in my games I like to give multiple ways of solving a quest. On main story quests, you have to have it for all the different roles you're planning for. Stealth, combat, dialogue. Here's the problem with timed quests and multiple quest solutions. If there's one way that's usually faster, for example, if dialogue was faster, if you can just click on something and boom, quest solved, people just have to do that. It's such a design hand of the designer saying the way I expect you to do this is the fast way because it's timed. And if the designer doesn't want to do that, then you have to make the timer long enough that even the slowest way of doing it, like stealth, which may require sitting there and waiting to figure out patterns and trying to get around people and picking locks and climbing walls and going around the back way and climbing through vents and waiting for people to move away from doors. If that's slow and you put in a timed quest and you don't make it slow enough for that one, people can't do it. And if I make a stealth character, that's my shelf moment. But if you make it slow enough for the slowest one, then the fastest one, which maybe just kill everybody in the room and go in, it's like, why is this timed? Why did it give me 4 hours to do this? It took me 10 game minutes to do it. It's because of multiple quest solutions. But here's the even worse thing. Here's the worst thing I think I can say about timed quests. If a quest is timed and it's super important, but the timer really doesn't matter, or the timer is put in to be so long that there's really no way you could have not had that done, then you basically just took your sense of urgency and threw it out the window, which is the only reason to have a timed quest. I can't think of any other reason you can throw out that doesn't apply to all the other quests that are in the game. So those are a lot of the reasons I don't do time quests anymore, and I wasn't really too fond of Fallout's timer. However, Fallout's timer made me think that's not necessarily a quest timer. It's more of a story timer. And you can argue whether or not a story timer is attached to a particular quest or not. But there are games out there where there's no particular quest you have to do. It's just you have to get the story to a certain state by a certain time, or you fail. These are really no different than quest timers. These have all the same pros and cons. It gives you the one advantage of urgency, which I think is and a ton of the obligation and feeling bad and imbalance between solutions that you get from timed quests. So timed stories aren't that much better. But that makes me want to talk about game time in general. Game time as a concept. And what's interesting about this is game time is not real time. It's never real time. If the players can pause your game for any reason, if they bring up the main menu, pauses the game, your game doesn't align real time with game time. If the player can save the game and come back, again, game time isn't aligned with real time. Because the player may stop for weeks and months before they come back to play, and all that urgency that you thought you were getting is right out the window. The only time I can think I've ever played a game whose real time aligned with game time was an early MMO, and I want to say it was EverQuest, where the servers worked on 24-hour clocks, just like our world, and I happened to be playing a server that was in my time zone. So whenever I logged in, it was whatever time it was where I was. So I usually can only play in the evening. So for the first several weeks I was playing this game, I only saw zones at night. It was weird. I finally, and it was because when it came out, I was working hard at spinning up Troika. I finally got a Saturday to play, a Saturday afternoon, and I saw a zone during the daytime, and I was like, wow. I didn't even think there was daytime in this game. So that was a weird time where game time and real time kind of overlap, but you could still save your character and quit out. The game world kept going without you, but it didn't happen to your character. So it's just weird how game time and real time never really align. In fact, now let's talk about how game time interacts with other features in your game. I'll talk about the two biggest ones that came to mind for me, which were fast travel and turn-based combat. So fast travel and game time, I did a whole video about fast travel, and I'll link it below. But the big question out of that was, do game timers advance while you're doing fast travel? And I talked about how that might affect status effects. In fact, there's a video about status effect linked below as well. If you have a status effect on you that's doing damage to you and you start to fast travel, does that timer advance with the fast travel? And there's all these problems. If it doesn't advance, then you end up with this weird disconnect between game time and real time. And that disconnect will reduce any sense of urgency that you're trying to get out of using timers on quests or story. But if they do align, if fast travel does make real time pass, then what happens if one of your quest or story timers expires in the middle of fast travel? It's that same problem with status effects. Do I fall over dead in the middle of fast travel? You're going along the map and it just goes, you're dead. Or do you arrive at the destination dead? In this case, do you arrive at the destination and it's like, hey, that person you were supposed to kidnap or you were supposed to rescue from being kidnapped, they're dead now. Good for you. Here's the problem with that. Even if you accept that, here's the worst problem. What if a player fast travels somewhere, that advances the timer, and then they realize there's absolutely no way to get back in time. There is no way they can find that person and get back to where they have to turn in the quest without that timer expiring. So in other words, they're still playing, they still have the quest, the timer is not expired, but they know it's already too late. There's nothing more disheartening than playing a game with a timer like that. But if you think fast travel is bad, let's talk about turn-based combat and game time. One question would be, is time passing during turn-based combat? And how does it pass? If it doesn't pass, then how do status effects tick inside of combat? Are they based on rounds? And then there are other status effects that are based on time, and when you come out of combat, time just starts up again? That's weird. That's inconsistent. But if time does pass during turn-based combat, you have to figure out exactly how long a turn is. And that will, handle the case of how quest and story timers advance. Imagine before going to turn in a quest, you have a lot of time, you hit a random encounter, combat starts up, and the quest expires. Because you thought you still had a few minutes left, but guess what? Every turn of combat is a minute, and it took you 10 turns to finish that combat. 10 minutes went by, quest expired. Sucks to be you, right? But one thing that has to happen is if you have both real-time and turn-based combat, like I did in Arcanum, which I do not recommend, I had to make sure both of those made sense with game time. And since real time aligned with game time, except when you pause or save the game, that meant attacks in both modes should, to the player, feel like they take around the same amount of time. So throwing the spell, moving over here, attacking someone with a melee weapon, both real-time and turn-based combat should seem to take about the same amount of time. And if they don't, everything gets out of whack between the player's perception of time and game time. So that's even a worse thing, and that's why I'd recommend not having real-time and turn-based combat in the same game, right there. So, in general, all of this is why I don't really use time quest or time stories anymore. They're about trying to force some sense of urgency, which you cannot. And then it's about making game time and all the related features in the game that are important to the player, and your design choices are dependent on those concepts of time, but it may not be obvious to the player what design choices you have made until it bites them by having them fail a timed quest or a timed story because of some design choice you made about how features interact with the actual flow of time. So that's one reason I avoid the whole thing now, because there's really no way you can do it that won't upset and anger some chunk of your fan base. And I don't think it's needed. I don't think that sense of urgency is real in any case. So I hope Fanda6122, this answers your question.